Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should.
Our guest today is Peter Gorges. He is co-founder of UJAM, co-founder of Wizoo, and a number of other things that he's co-founded, and he eschews any formal titles, so we won't give him one. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Daniel.
We were just discussing the fact that off camera that you don't tend to use titles in your company, which is kind of interesting. I think it speaks to a very interesting business structure, and we'll get into that a little bit. But I first want to start with some of your background. Obviously, you started out as a musician. I assume keyboard is your main instrument?
Yes.
I see guitars behind you, so one never knows.
Oh, that guitar is a total disguise. That sits there because one of my Corona project was starting to teach myself guitar. I'm super bad at it. No, my main instrument is here, like there behind the microphone.
Good. Okay. Well, it's interesting because there is sort of a. I'm mainly a bass player and, play guitar a little bit, enough to mash it. But, I think there's always this interesting sort of changeover when you pick up a different instrument and you have to reorient yourself, So, it's
and I enjoy it. I'm just really not good at it. And I'm a lefty, which makes it even, and I want to teach stuff to myself, so I don't have a teacher. But that's the experience that I'm looking for.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm mostly a lefty, but I play guitar right-handed, and I've always been very grateful for that because I don't have to look for special instruments,
Right.
Yeah. So I was looking through. You gave me a little bit of notes on your past, and I see that you that your early career was mainly as a musician, but it seems like you also merged a lot of other disciplines. You were writing both articles and books on technology. You were working with other software manufacturers, I assume, based on your communications that you were probably working on things like writing marketing copy and stuff like this too. I've always thought that's very interesting how many of us, we delve into a lot of multiple disciplines at the same time.
Yeah. It just that wasn't a goal of mine. I wanted to, like many in our industry, when I was like 14, I wanted to become a rock star.
Really?
For a change. That didn't happen. I made it as far as being a keyboardist in a band, and then our local studio, kind of in some way I got into our local studio and became like the resident keyboard guy there. But that was a local studio in Germany. That's not a stepping stone to an international career or to anywhere. But I was, I realized that my talent as a musician was pretty limited. Like I'm an okay keyboard player, like an okay professional keyboard player. I'm not exceptional in any way, but I have this knack for synthesizers and for writing. And so when I left high school, I wanted to study music software development because that was my main interest. So I went to Dortmund Technical University and I studied, which is called in Germany, Informatik, computer science. In 1984, computer science and music. And music was basically Bach and Mozart and classical music. And computer science was what computer science was at the time. It taught you processor networks and very small chips like an Intel 8088 or whatever the name. I wanted to learn how to write music software, which wasn't really a thing at the time. There was like Steinberg 16 plus for the C64. I think that's what got me started.
It's mostly sequencing stuff, right?
Yes.
MIDI sequencing.
Like the predecessor of Cubase today.
Yeah.
But what I didn't learn was, that's not what I learned. I was totally not interested. So also our university was we were like 2,000 students for a university that was made for 600. So it wasn't fun to, and like even if you had to do your programming exercises, you had to come at night and type it into a Unix machine and then come back the next morning to see the printout. And if that had a wrong semicolon, you had to come back. So long story short, I left university, did my what we called Zivildienst, civil service in Germany. And by the time I had finished that, I was making more money than a finished computer scientist in Germany through freelance writing and freelance studio jobs. So I never went back to that career path.
Interesting. Now, this was obviously pretty early days, as you say. I mean, there were no digital audio workstations, and in fact, I think the actual recording of audio on computers was almost non-existent, as I recall.
Yeah, in my world, recording audio was multi-track, and there was a tape machine, in those days. Yeah. And I remember, I think the first time I used a digital audio workstation myself was like the mid-90s, Logic Audio or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And I remember so much missing the machine noise back in the machine room. That was my first impression of digital audio recording.
Yes. Well, my first one was Cubase VST. We were beta testing that, and same thing. And the other thing about it was, of course, it was so it was not quite dependable at that point. It crashed on a regular basis, and so most of the time we were running tape backup, just in case, and most of the time we ended up going back to the tape. But what's interesting to me about that is that there's a left brain and right brain component to it. And of course, all musicians have this left brain component anyway, because you need it to learn your tools. But the technical side of that, which seems to be where you sort of, where you began leaning, I'm always interested in how those two aspects find their balance within each individual.
That's interesting, because I'm called the right brain in UJAM. Seriously, I have a business partner who's who runs the company, who's amazing, an amazing strategist, who's amazing at complex, thinking through complex things, like when we have a contract negotiation of a bigger deal or whatever. He has the discipline. He can think 3 steps ahead and all that kind of stuff. My strongest thing is intuition. Like, I cannot be good in anything that I have no intuition for. I cannot teach myself anything that I have no intuition for. And technology, to be honest with you, I remember when I got my first synthesizer, which was a Korg MS-20. And that thing, I had never touched such a thing before. All I had seen before was I was at a trade show with my father. I saw one of those things, and all of a sudden my room at my parents' house was full of posters of Korg synthesizers, and so I read what was on their front panels, and I tried to read up in magazines. There was really little to read at that time, but when I got the thing, I went down to the basement of my parents, and I came up an hour later or so. I knew how it worked. And not by understanding technically what an oscillator is or a filter is. I don't know, somehow I just knew what it does. And that's always been the case for me. I could never teach myself anything that I don't intuitively understand.
Yeah. I'm of a very similar bent, but I think, at the same time, the intuitive has to be informed by, the right brain has to be informed by the left brain somehow. And a lot of times, as I think I kind of dive in, we're not the RTFM type necessarily,
No, the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And actually that's also something that I trained when I was writing reviews for German Keyboards magazine. I made it a thing that whenever I got a new product, I would not read the manual.
Yes.
And try to understand the product without reading anything about it. And that was a big aspect later on in my impression and my verdict.
Doesn't that sort of help you understand it? I mean, you're tapping into that left brain aspect by having to write those pieces.
Yes.
And it's almost like forcing yourself to get into it on that technical basis.
Yeah, you may be right. maybe I just don't. I have no left brain ambition. That's probably what it is. So I don't value my left brain as much as I value my right brain.
But I almost laugh at that because, it's a willful ignoring of this aspect of something that actually you can't ignore, because without it, you won't be able to use those right brain tools.
Of course, writing articles, writing books, starting a company, those are left brain things, right?
Yeah.
But they were only left brain tools letting me do my right brain stuff. They were never what I, enjoyed or indulged in.
So let's get into a little bit of it just for people who don't know who you are, and what your history is. You started out as more or less a session musician and a writer of articles and documentation. And then you put together a company called Wizoo.
Mm-hmm.
And that company sort of had an interesting arc in itself, because if I remember it right, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because this is many years and many brain cells ago. But as I remember it, you guys started out as mainly just writing and putting together stuff. I remember seeing your stuff bundled in the German magazines, CD-ROMs and stuff like this, but not necessarily making products. And then at some point, I remember seeing one day that, Wizoo has their own instruments now.
Yeah.
How did that all develop?
That developed because of my history as both a sound designer and a writer. Mm-hmm. So, parallel to my writing, like writing editorial stuff at Keyboards Magazine, my books, I worked as a sound designer for synthesizer companies. And I also produced sample CDs or sample CD-ROMs at the time. And I was actually planning to continue to do that. But at some point, Keyboards Magazine ran a survey. And it came out, like, I'm trying to make this short, I was their most popular author. So they approached me and said, why don't we turn this into a business? Why don't we start a company together? And I basically said to them, look, the only thing I can offer you guys to do is, okay, let's make it a book publishing company that also does sample CD-ROMs. So for the first, that's why you saw us. And by the way, because it was co-owned by German Keyboards magazines, you saw our stuff bundled. And we also had a little column in there, like in every Keyboards magazine, there was like a Wizoo lounge. There was articles actually from American writers translated into German. So German people get to read international stuff.
In fact, I have to thank you for that, because you guys were one of the resources that I used to learn German when I moved to Germany and started producing records there. Because, those were the kind of things I couldn't learn in a normal German course. Nobody understood, the technical term.
Yeah. So and we did that for the first, I guess, 3 years. But, I still continued my working for companies and doing projects with companies. Like, back in the day, I did a lot with Kawai, some stuff with Waldorf and Nord, pretty much everybody who did something in the keyboard synthesizer world. And then at some point, I had a product idea, and I went to Steinberg with it. It was called VST Drum Sessions. The idea was sliced up multi-track drum songs that people could use. And this was before virtual instruments. So I went to Steinberg with it, and they liked it, and it was a success. And then when Charlie Steinberg invented virtual instruments, basically, he approached us about creating the content for the first one, Steinberg LM4, for example. And that way we collaborated closer and closer with Steinberg, did a lot of Steinberg virtual instruments, and eventually that turned into Wizoo Steinberg virtual instruments. That's how you saw us doing products. But it was more like Steinberg gave us their brand and their youth distribution. And we basically, we built the product. Steinberg would eventually do a UI or whatever, but it was a collaboration at the time.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. It was. I remember our first. We did the first virtual grand piano called the Grand.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember, on a current Macintosh, when we released it in the best quality, it had like 4 voices. It's much different these days.
But it was interesting to see all of that developing, because to a certain extent, you almost had to sort of pick your camp. You had eMagic on one side, you had Steinberg, doing their thing. And I think, what was it? Hallion, that was their first streaming
That
instrument.
was the sampler. Yeah, that introduced streaming.
And then you also had Giga Studio, or what were they called? Nemesis.
Yes.
That's what they were called back then.
Wow, your memory is much better than mine. But yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
I think they were the first disc streaming sampler, right? The first commercial. Sampler.
Yeah. I remember a lot of this because I was working in those circles at the time as well. Right. To a certain extent, it was almost a battle of, who would survive and who would become the standards. And so, you talk about right-brain stuff, but creating those, even programming samples, that's very left-brained if you think about it.
And I hated it, maybe because of that. I mean, seriously, and that's probably what why I'm doing what I'm doing these days. I really hated sitting there cleaning up stuff, neatly organizing and mapping samples. I really like to create sounds. So synthesizers were always closer to me than samplers. Although, they were limited. I could do a choir with a synthesizer or an orchestra. Sure. But no, my job, in Wizoo had always been, I enjoyed more thinking up, like starting projects, thinking up projects, and then finding somebody to actually execute them and doing them myself.
Yeah, that sounds like me also. I mean, I love conceiving of the project, but at a certain point, you wish you have somebody to clean up all that stuff and organize it. Yeah, make it so, and I'm going to go on to the next idea.
Yeah, and you're right. In the beginning, it was like that. It was more like I always believed, okay, if I could do it all on my own, it would be better. But I don't enjoy it, so I'll pay somebody. But these days, it's really different because we have such a experienced team. I mean, we've done virtual instruments for 20 years now.
Yeah.
Some of the people I work with today have been with me for that whole period. So, of course, obviously, it also adds something to the products if I don't do everything by myself.
Sure. And that's an interesting point. I think for the most part, a lot of the really, really brilliant products and brilliant ideas and even brilliant musical creations, they're a product of collaboration.
Yeah. And plus, imagine, if you wanted to do a software electric piano in 95, you could do it all by yourself. You could, maybe you already had the piano, you would sample it, you would put it into an archive. I had archive samplers at the time. You put it into an archive sampler, map it there with no editor software, and pretty much deliver the finished product to somebody to distribute it for you. These days, a virtual instrument, that's way more complex. That's something I would almost go like, nobody could do this all by themselves. I mean, there's the aspect of course, the samples, they are way more complex. Now you not only have sampling, but you also have modeling behaviors, like how does the piano react to how you play. Then you need an engine, then you need effects. You need all these things, and somebody needs to build the plugin. Somebody needs to test the plugin. So it's I don't think that there's anybody in the world who can still, can build a whole virtual instrument by themselves, unless it's a synthesizer, maybe.
It's just like a musical work. I mean, anytime you collaborate with others, they're going to bring something to the party that you didn't necessarily bring.
Yes, but that's totally, there's no but. That's totally true. For me, the biggest difficulty was because I'm so like autodidactic, like in my core, and so self-made. It was really, really the hardest thing for me was to learn trust. Like to trust somebody else with something.
Yes.
Particularly, I'm challenging myself every day to trust more and more and more. And it's great when I do it. It's really not great when I don't, because everybody feels kind of awkward. But that was the challenge for me.
I think one of the challenges of being self-taught is that you learn the rules kind of backward, sort of inside out. You learn them by doing something and going, oh shit, that didn't work. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. And of course, the advantages are that you break the rules a lot of times, but sometimes I think it takes us a lot longer to get to that point than people who learn it by rote.
Yes. And, and still in, during my freelancer period, which lasted 12, 13 years, I enjoyed very much working in teams. but only teams of freelancers. So like everybody knew if you fail here, you're not going to get the next call. Everybody was a total professional, and everybody had to self-organize in a way. And I really, what I really hated, thank God, was only 4 years in my career, was the corporate world. Oh, yeah. I don't work with the corporate. Well, not only the obvious stuff like, I have an idea, I have to go through 7 people, to get their signature. I guess everybody hates that. But I also hate an atmosphere where not everybody is like a mini entrepreneur. Where not everybody goes to bed and wakes up with how are we going to get this thing done and has a passion for it.
Not everybody is invested. That's what it is.
Yeah. And that takes us back to why we don't have any titles in UJAM. This is actually based on the German word is Menschenbild. It's like how you value a human how you see a human person.
Yes.
Most companies these days have hierarchies and are based on the premise that, like, I'm the founder and I'm one of the general managers, so I must be smarter than somebody else. And that's absolutely not how we work. And you get power and influence through your business card. In UJAM, it's much different. If I have any power, if I have anything to say in UJAM, it's because people trust me and people see my competence. Where they don't see it, they're not going to ask me. And believe me, I didn't like that 7 years ago or 8 years ago when we started. But it's so much more gratifying now.
I think it also gives every individual the opportunity to really to rise to their talents in that sense.
Yeah, yeah, and they do. They actually absolutely do. You will see. I've seen people grow from, like a guy running automated tests to somebody who runs a whole team and through the whole process of creating a really complex virtual instrument, including communication, organizing people, tracking progress, all that kind of stuff. And only because we put him into that position and let him do that stuff.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because there was a period of my career where I came up through recording studios, and there's a hierarchy in the recording studio world where you started out as the gopher, the person going and grabbing the meals and cleaning the toilets and doing whatever needed to be done. And eventually, if you proved yourself, then you might get in to be able to do session work or something like that, and eventually become an engineer and maybe progress to being a producer. Yeah. And being the stubborn autodidact that I am, I started almost immediately sneaking into the sessions and watching them, even though I had been hired to do something else. And, there really is a certain hierarchy. And if you don't fit that hierarchy, you have to kind of go independent in order to teach yourselves those things. And, I think the advent of home recording gear, project studio gear, made that more possible. And these days we have a lot more producer engineers who came up without necessarily experiencing that studio world and studio hierarchy, which is good and bad.
It's good and bad. I was going to say.
Yeah, because they don't learn a lot of the psychology of working in the creative process. But at the same time, there are also some of those barriers removed.
Yeah, I mean, in UJAM, I wouldn't say we have no hierarchy. It's not like, we do, everything is a democratic process, or, everybody can say, has as much to say as I have.
That's anarchy.
That's no. We have a hierarchy, but it's a hierarchy of competence and trust. And I would say my experience in the studio world was the same, because I started as the guy setting up the microphones in the morning. I was like an intern, right? And I got my chance only because they recorded a band at the time, and the keyboardist really sucked. He was supposed to play a synthesizer solo, and he couldn't do it within an hour or so. And they went to have dinner, and I just said, "May I have a go?" And that was, and did it in one take, because it wasn't really hard. And that was my, that hierarchy allowed me, to go where I went.
Yeah. Let's track that progression, because we've jumped into talking about UJAM, and I want to sort of trace the Wizoo to UJAM arc with you a little bit, because there's a lot of interesting little steps in there.
Yes.
So Wizoo, you eventually merged with Steinberg.
Yes, they became So Wizoo was split eventually into two parts in 2000, into a publishing branch, which is now owned by Thomann, and into what we call Wizoo Sound Design GmbH. That was the virtual instrument company, and Steinberg became a major shareholder in that in 2003.
And then at a certain point, you stepped away from that.
Wizoo eventually got acquired by Digidesign, and we became Digi. So what happened was in 2003, Hans Zimmer became a shareholder in Wizoo, and that opened us, obviously that opened us a lot of doors, and exposed us in the industry way more than a small German software company could ever do on their own. And so Digidesign got us on their radar because they were shopping for a virtual instrument company that they wanted to acquire to build instruments for Pro Tools, because they wanted to make a move into music creation.
Right.
So in 2005, they acquired us. And we just got renamed into Air Music Technology, and became Digidesign's virtual instrument little Pluto in the Avid universe.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit there, because there's an important point in there. All of a sudden, Hans Zimmer comes into the equation. This doesn't happen overnight either. Did you know Hans, or did he come in through another channel?
It happened. No, I didn't know him. Well, I knew Hans Zimmer, bigger than life.
But you didn't know him personally. Yeah,
I didn't know him personally. I got introduced to him through Manfred Rürup, former CEO of Steinberg, who became my mentor in the 2 years leading up to the Digi acquisition in Wizoo.
Okay,
like my older brother, and still a super good friend, amazing guy. And he and Hans had known each other for a while. And I think what triggered Hans's decision was that Creamware, which you probably remember, was also a digital audio company in Germany.
Yeah.
They had gone bankrupt, and their development team was up for grabs. And we hired them at the time. And that Hans basically said to me, "Look, Peter, I'll put a chunk of money in your company. You hire that team, and you guys build me a sampler." That's pretty much how we became a shareholder. And we started building his sampler, but we never finished it, because then Digi came and bought us. And I found it extremely generous of Hans, when I called him and said, "Look, we have an offer from Digidesign, but it means you're not going to get your sampler." He let me do that acquisition, because he knew for everybody else it was the better career path.
That's interesting. And I sort of want to take a little bit of a side jaunt here, because you were talking about Manfred becoming sort of your mentor. I think one of the things that is very, very valuable in not only in our industry, but in any career, is the understanding of relationships, the understanding of, we call it networking, but it's a lot more than just networking. It's not just going out and shaking hands and stuff like that. It's really, again, it comes back to the whole collaboration thing, and how, you really understand the value of the synergies of working with other people.
Yes. I would say in my, in my life, the important relationships are just a few, but super important ones.
Yeah.
And most people who know me are, from the industry, are very, very surprised to learn that I'm really an introvert at heart. I'm not good at networking. I'm not good at picking up the phone. I'm good at keeping relationships once they go beyond a certain level, and once I've I can trust people probably more than most people. Like I trusted and trust Manfred way more than you would usually trust somebody who's a business partner, because he also had stakes in Wizoo, and so that allowed me to probably learn more from him in 2 or 3 years than you would do in a normal business relationship. But I know people, and we have people in UJAM who are amazing, at networking and getting, picking up the phone, getting things done that way. I totally suck at that. I'm too introvert. I avoid trade shows because of that.
It's interesting. I would say I'm somewhere in the middle.
You have to be.
And I understand that because it's funny. I was working on a blog post recently about the idea of being an introverted extrovert.
Yeah.
And it's
I'm the other way around, actually.
An extroverted introvert. Yeah.
I look like an extrovert, but I'm an introvert.
Interesting. Yeah. But I think regardless of how introverted one is, I think there's a real value to relationships. And I totally understand, there are, if we walk through a trade show, there are 100 people we can say hello to and, oh, it's wonderful to see you and everything. But there's really only a small handful of people who you would invest that kind of trust in.
Yes.
But I think those relationships are very important the same way when you find a great musical collaboration or something like that, because those relationships tend to define the directions we go in our own endeavors.
Yes. And relationships, I sign that with blood. I just make the distinction between networking and relationships. I have just a few relationships that I really value and that I need. Networking, not so much.
Well, and networking it's a buzzword.
Yeah.
But
it's an art. It's an art that
it is an art. And, I too have collaborators that I work with who are brilliant networkers, and I'm immensely grateful to them because they bring other people to me, but at the same time, I think it's really a fine art to be able to do that. I think it's more important to have those very, very deep relationships that are vested in trust, because that's where you really start to grow your dreams.
My career is a long list of mentors. Like every step in my life that I've ever made, there was somebody behind it that helped me do it. It was like, starting Wizoo was because of Gerald Dellmann, who was chief editor at Keyboards Magazine at the time, who pretty much gave me the business infrastructure. I mean, remember, I was a freelancer. I was not a book publisher. I was not somebody who could, run a company. Then the next step of, taking Wizoo to the next level, that was Manfred. Then Hans, of course, did, he opened me so many doors. I started UJAM. I wouldn't have started UJAM if not, for Hans. We started it, two of us on his terrace shaking hands. And, I can, of course, very carefully always use, I can still use Hans or call him and ask him for help or, whatever. He's always there, although he's not in our everyday business. Makes a huge difference. Then Dave Liebold, the guy who bought Wizoo for Digidesign, he was the only person I ever reported to, and he wasn't easy to work with, but mainly because he was so incredibly, at least in part, he was so incredibly competent. I learned so much from him. It was worth it for me. And so, so there's always been people who, mentored me into my next how do you say, like, step of development. And right now it's younger people, actually. My business partner, Axel Hansen, he's been my mentor for the last 3, 4, 5 years. And I learned most of the things from him. And he's 40 or 42 or whatever.
Yeah, well, that's interesting too, because as you say, I mean, they're not necessarily always older and wiser, quote unquote. A lot of times they are younger, but they have something to teach us. And I think the nature of a self-taught person is that you're always sort of open to just soaking stuff up like a sponge.
Yes. And I also, I myself, I love mentoring.
Yeah.
I love to do it, from my end. And actually that is, when people ask me, what do you do in UJAM? I always say, well, I enable people to do what I do today in 3 to 5 years. Like, my product is people, it's not products. I've done products long enough.
There's your title, mentor in chief.
No, we have a bunch of those, but no, silverback in chief. If you know,
There you go. But it is interesting because I see that in many people, including myself. You know, you get to a point where you realize that, oh, wait a minute, I'm mentoring someone else too. And to a certain extent, you know, because we are self-taught, because of the aspects of, you know, what they call imposter syndrome and all of those other things, you know,
I know
you
that
almost
very
feel
well.
like, yeah, well, we all do, you know, but you almost feel like, well, why are you asking me? You know, and people could say to you, you know, like, well, you're the expert, and you, you know, it's kind of this.
And here's the weird thing: I don't know how you would call it. I have a very weird imposter syndrome. I'm never surprised when someone asks me because a part of me knows exactly why they do. Just when I then do what I'm asked to do, I have this. This isn't good. This isn't good. They're gonna find you out. It's really weird. Like it's schizophrenic.
I was speaking to someone the other day who said, yeah, you know, I'm always afraid someone's going to open the door to my studio and go, you don't know what you're doing, do you?
Yeah, I know that one very well.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, it's interesting because we have so many years in our professions, you know, and you know, like you, many of us, we go through multiple careers
Hmm.
as part of an overall career arc.
Hmm.
And I think in doing that, you know, you realize that I'm really kind of just bellying up to the buffet of life.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So, you know, again, for people who don't necessarily know who you are and what you've done, it's a fascinating career arc. So, so you ended up teaming up with Hans to start UJAM.
Yeah, it came about because I had always done my own thing in a way, and it always led to the next step up. Like if up just meant it would interest me more, or make more money, or whatever it was.
I call it
And
letting the path light up as you walk on it, you know.
exactly. And when I joined Digidesign, it was amazing for 2 years. It totally changed my life at the time because before we were the small company, I had these moments every month where my wife, who ran finances in Wizoo and does it in UJAM as well, when she presented me like, okay, this is the money we have, this is the invoices we have to pay, pick up the phone. I had that stuff for years, right? um, and in Digidesign, and Wizoo doing a new instrument without Steinberg's support, nobody gave a shit seriously. And with Digidesign, everything changed. Like everything we did, the world was naturally interested in it. It was usually always a success. We had so much muscle behind us. I didn't have to care about finances or anything, right? So it felt, and I had Dave Liebold, to look up to and learn from for 2 years. And then, as you probably know, and many people in this industry know, Avid took a turn, not necessarily for the better, like after 2 years. And I hung in because that's what my contract dictated. And I wanted to be, I didn't want to leave my people alone. That was a team that I had built for like almost 10 years by the time I left. So it took me 4 years actually to leave Avid because I was so unhappy, and I was extremely frustrated with the corporate world. I was extremely frustrated with not creating any innovation because in Digidesign the reality was you create probably 2% innovation, or at the time, although you have a team of 20 software developers, just because you have to deal with so much maintenance stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, I was super fed up actually with the pro world, like with the professional users, because you know how it is. Like at that time, gear sluts. Like I hated to look into gear sluts whenever we released a product because there was like the first post was always somebody who would find something that he didn't like, and then shitstorm would start.
Yep.
And here's what informed what I did next. Guitar Hero came around, and Guitar Hero made $1 billion in the US only with something that was 15 years behind us technologically.
Yeah.
and it had millions of super grateful users. And I was like, okay, so why am I working my ass off for all these, nitpickers? Why don't I do something for millions of people who will really be grateful for that, right? So why don't we do something in the consumer world? Why don't we, whatever it is? And my idea was rather actually doing another kind of music game. I wanted to do something for the PlayStation or whatever. But anyway, so Hans basically was just picking at me. So why are you still a cog in the, how do you say, like a cog in the
cog in the wheel? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the wheel. Mm-hmm. Why don't we do something new together? Something exciting. And he had done that for my whole time at Digidesign. And finally, I just gave in and I said, like, you know what? I can afford to not make any money for 2 years. Let's just do it. We don't know what we're going to do, but let's just do it. We shook hands, and that was it. We had no idea. So then I left Digidesign. It took me like three months, NAMM farewell tour, and transition for my employees and stuff. And then basically spent 6 months flying back and forth from Bremen, Germany to LA. And Hans brought in Pharrell Williams, who to my, I have to admit, I didn't know at the time, which is, I still feel shame, but I met him there. And the three of us basically just brainstormed about what would be cool to do. And Hans and Pharrell introduced me to, we went to Activision, to Bob Kotick, the CEO at the time. I don't know if he's still CEO. And we basically pitched a kind of a, Pharrell hero game to him, where the idea was that you learn beatboxing and drum programming and da-da-da-da-da. And eventually, whatever, Sony or Coca-Cola would do national contests hosted by Pharrell, where people, that kind of stuff. It was hip at the time. Uh-huh. And Bob Kotick basically told us, look, if you can pull off stuff like that, don't do a game, do a platform. Like, do something big in the cloud. And introduced us to an extremely interesting guy called Mark Kwame, who was a partner at Sequoia Capital at the time. With Mark, we came up with the idea of, okay, let's build something where people can sing into a microphone, that whatever it is that we build runs on a server in the cloud and returns a playback that matches whatever that person has sung, which meant, recording or, into a server, interpreting what the person wanted to sing, figuring out the chords, and creating a multi-track arrangement. And we built that.
It's pretty ambitious.
Yes, but that's why I left Avid, to build something completely new and ambitious.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And so the technical challenge wasn't that hard for us. We had done similar stuff before. We just put a few pieces together, and it worked brilliantly. And we launched it. And we went to a tech conference, TechCrunch Disrupt, which was like, a competition. We scored runner-up without even a product. That was an alpha version that we demoed there. So it was highly demoable. We had super success in terms of attention. And we confused that, like today, that's how I call it. Like we confused that with actually business potential. So all the big VCs wanted to invest in us, and we went with one of them, and blah blah blah, and lived the dream for two years of being a startup and never really verifying if it has any merit. And 2012 we had a fallout with our investors, and we had to think about what to do with the company. So basically that soap bubble exploded in 2012. And the way I put it these days is we spend $6 million on finding out that people don't make music because they don't want to make music. They want to listen to music, but it's not like 1 million housewives or students or kids don't make music because there's not an iPhone app that makes it super easy. We proved that that's not the case.
But now UJAM did evolve into something completely different.
What we did was we worked for other companies, like we did projects for other companies, and we could charge crazy day rates. Mm-hmm. And what we did was invest the margins into slowly building up our own catalog of our own products, which we have these days. Mm-hmm. And a big step in this whole thing was a meeting that I had with Ernst Nathorst Bös, at the time the CEO of Propeller. Like, we had coffee every Frankfurt Music Messe.
Mhm.
And so we had our coffee and we were just talking. And when we got up, he said, like, oh, and by the way, could you guys build a sampler for Reason? Streaming sampler for Reason? And I went like, yeah, of course. Do you know somebody who could do it? And I said, you know what? I'll do it. So
Mhm.
and so we built what was called IDT in the Reason world. And that was a way for people to build rack extensions, which is their VST, AU, or whatever plugins,
Yeah.
rack extensions based on samples. And so at the time, what we did was to demo that engine, or to verify that it's bug free and runs on 1,000 computers. We built our own first products. We revived the virtual guitarist idea, virtual guitarist, which we had done with Steinberg, 2001. And then it went from there. And today it's become Gorilla Engine, which is our Gorilla Engine today. That started at that little, coffee table at Frankfurt Music Messe.
But again, based on relationships.
Yes.
There are many, many brilliant people.
Yeah.
But I think, it's the same thing like with musical talent. You can find virtuosic players who can't get arrested. But I think the value of those relationships, the value of being able to collaborate.
Mm-hmm.
I do a panel at NAMM every year on the art of production. And part of that, what's important to me, is not your prowess as an engineer or understanding which microphone to use. It's the understanding of how the creative minds work together. And I think that seems to be at the root of almost everything that's driven your career as well.
You have no idea, Daniel. What you just said, that informed my decision not to become a sound engineer, because I wanted to become a sound engineer first. And so I went to that studio and became an intern. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't a studio that would usually record, Led Zeppelin or the likes. It was like, small German acts, and not all of them were necessarily musically good or experienced in a studio environment. So I thought, okay, a sound engineer is somebody, who lets people into the studio, then they do amazing things. He makes more amazing mix out of that. And then he gets a credit on the record. That was what I thought a sound engineer was. And what I learned was that guy was a psychologist. Like, every day he had to patiently tell people why that note was wrong. And it took me a whole week to just, only a week, to leave the studio and go, no, man, I could never do what I would buy after a week would be a flamethrower. So, but speaking to what you just said, like, relationships, they saved our lives, because of course you can't just come out of the blue and go, hey, we're a company with music technologists and cloud engineers, and people just waited for you. What we did for the first 3, 4, 5 years was monetize our relationships in the industry and the trust we had built in our former careers, of course. That would open people's minds to, hey, we can build you this or that. And they would trust us to be able to do that, because it was like $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 projects. Yeah. So, yeah, you're totally right.
It's interesting, because that's a conversation I have a lot of times with audio students now, and especially in this day and age where so many of us grow up in this sort of bubble. They learn in this sort of bubble. Mm-hmm. And again, especially as a self-taught individual, we are in our bubble, but the value of intersecting our bubble with other people's bubbles, I think it can't be overestimated. I mean, to me, it's probably one of the most important things. The Beatles would not have been the Beatles if it was just individuals, because it's the synergy of those working relationships and the trust that you invest in other people and that they invest in you that I think really creates greatness, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I would add one more thing. I can at least say that for myself. I think one big talent I have over a lot of people, even that I work with, is because I was such a shy and insecure kid. I had to constantly I wanted to please people. I couldn't stand being repelled. No, is that the right word?
Rejected.
Rejected.
Mhm.
I couldn't stand that. So I kind of, from the age of whatever, 4 or whatever, I trained reading people's mind for getting the right reaction. And it is something that you need very much in negotiations, in figuring out what does like when you're a freelance writer or book writer or whatever, you have to figure out what, or you make sounds or samples for a company. You have to want to understand what is it that they need from you. And now in UJAM, actually my a much better title, like I could have there if we had titles, would be I'm the chief user simulator, because it's a total thing for me to think a product from the viewpoint of the user, because if you it's so tempting if you have you have an idea that totally intrigues you and just build the thing, and when people don't like it, too stupid, go somewhere else. To be like that. But if you really make it a thing to really think a product, and I know, it's the Steve Jobs thing, blah, 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 blah. It's very easy to postulate that for yourself. But I think it's super important to hone that ability and to make the user the number one priority. And in UJAM, actually, we're seeing this. It took years to build trust, with our user base, and to teach people or to inform them of what are we about. We're not just another virtual instrument company. We have certain things, like a certain philosophy, and that only comes if you really think the whole thing from the user's end. And it totally pays off now. It was a bit of a risk, but it totally pays off now.
Well, it goes back to what you were speaking about earlier, about when you were writing all of these articles about keyboards.
Yeah.
Intending on intentionally not reading the manual, for example. I think that's the same thing, because you're saying, how would I approach this intuitively, not how would I approach it technically, because the intuition, the right-brained aspect of it in that sense is that's the trust factor.
Yes. And, I think my unique selling point, and readers and, my editorial editors at the time will tell you this, my unique selling point was a certain allergy for seriousness and authority. Because, at the time, a review of a big Yamaha keyboard was something very serious, and people would do measurements and
Oh, yeah.
And my thing was, and also my attitude was, my customer is the reader. It's not my editor, and it's not the industry. And so I made a whole point of writing reviews as if I would write them for my best buddy who had just worked a whole summer to afford this synthesizer. And I made fun of big companies. Just because I thought, well, Keyboard is the most successful magazines. They will be able to deal with it. And so thinking, from the users end, people totally honored that.
Yeah. And that's interesting, because Keyboard in particular, their reviews were very, very detailed, very lengthy, very intricate in getting into a lot of the technical aspects. And I remember often I would look at those, and, of course, I was also working to, perfect my German at the time. But it, a lot of it was just stuff I would just have to pass over it, because it was just, it went down too many very, very technical rabbit holes. And the bottom line is, how does this thing sound? Is it good? Are you going to use it? Or is it, just, a very complex instrument that you're never going to play with?
Yeah. And, I remember most writers at the time tried to just make their review bulletproof against the industry, which I totally wasn't interested in. Totally, because why? I mean, that forces you to take a synthesizer and basically start with describing the thing from the rear panel, left to right, and then the front panel from left top to, and you had lost me after a page. I was just not interested in that stuff. Exactly as you say.
Yeah.
Should I buy it? That was the question.
Right. It's I don't need to know how wavetable synthesis works.
No.
The same way I don't need to know how every bit of my car works. I just need to know that this pedal makes it go, this pedal makes it stop, and this thing makes a turn, and I can get in the car and drive. And I think that's the end result there, is that for a lot of people, I'm buying this for an instrument, for a creative purpose. I just want to know, how does it sound? Is it what I need? Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And is it better or worse than something else? So comparisons, I just made comparisons, whatever, let people complain.
Yeah. So bring me up to date. What is UJAM doing now? What are you doing these days?
So UJAM does three things. We still do contract projects for companies, mm-hmm. but these days it's mostly projects that also enable licensing business for us. So the second thing that we do, I should probably start with that. That's Gorilla Engine. That's what I just mentioned. It's pretty much a modular instrument building system. It's kind of like Lego for virtual instruments and also virtual audio effects. So it's completely modular. You can do anything with it. And we build our own stuff with it, but we also license it to other companies who don't want to go through, 3 years of building your own engine. Uh-huh. And it also makes them more flexible. So some of those customers, they know we need a certain kind of instrument. We're not an instrument company. Can you build the instrument for us? So that's what we do. But, it goes to, building the entire website for an infrastructure for extreme music and some of the technology behind it, which is a, production music company. So there's a whole span of that. And I'm in the, I mainly work in the second branch, which is our kind of like music software company. So where we build music software products and sell them. And my goal in that company has been since for 2 years now is that at some point we have like 50 or so virtual instruments and effects. Like we have, if you want to make music and you love UJAM, you don't have to go anywhere else. We have a complete catalog of stuff. Mm-hmm. And my main role is actually conceiving, being kind of like the guardian of the catalog, just because of my, my experience and knowing the competitive environment, guardian of the catalog, conceiving of new ideas, and, basically like writing them up to a degree where I can, hand them over to somebody like product owner, mm-hmm. and then just be or what we call a stakeholder. So basically just somebody who's available if you want to ask them. If people want to do it themselves, let them do it themselves. And I do pretty much everything. Sometimes I even write the manual. Sometimes I do presets. Sometimes I just give somebody an idea and then 2 months later I see the product. Uh-huh. And mainly, really, I try to turn people who start very young at UJAM to turn them into a younger version of myself.
Peter Gorges, thank you for being my guest.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was fun. I really enjoyed it.